Have you got big questions about God? Are you wrestling with doubts?
Welcome to Questioning Christianity.
We believe that truth invites questioning, and that faith is not a blind leap in the dark,
but a response to the light of God's revelation.
So whether it's God's hiddenness or history,
science or scripture,
ethics or evidence,
purpose or pain,
we create content to take questioners and their questions seriously.
We talk with scholars for expert insights and lay out the reasons why Christianity is worth believing.
Questioning Christianity.
Connecting the Christian story to life's deepest questions.
All right, well, welcome to Questioning Christianity. My name is Dan Patterson, and in this episode, we're diving into whether the apostles got the words of Jesus right. When it comes to the red letters in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in modern-day Bibles, how do we know that over the decades between Jesus uttering these words and their written record in the Gospels, that the memory of the apostles didn't just get a little shonky, and we have entire inventions in what we read today? My guest for this episode is Dr. David Graieg, all the way from Perth in Australia. I'm representing the East Coast. He's representing the West Coast, which I think is trying to secede from Australia right now anyway. There's a great political revolt that's going on. But David, so great to have you on the channel.
Yeah, glad for your ministry, and I've known you for almost close to a decade now. So yeah, it's good to see your good work and have a friendship with you.
Well, mate, let's dig in. The reason why I've got you on this topic of memory and whether it's reliable, can we really trust the apostles' memory and the oral traditions in the early church? Not many people think about what happens between Jesus saying these words in the 20s or 30s AD and then their written record in the Gospels decades later. It's like, what happened between those 2 points? How do we know that what Jesus said actually are the conversations remembered in the scriptures today? The reason why I've chosen you for this is because you did your PhD in the area of memory, if you remember correctly. Yeah. And so particularly in exploring 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and Paul's use there of pre-Paul's conversion traditions of early Christianity, that whole creedal statement of Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared. And then it gives a litany of 6 different chronological appearances of Jesus to Peter and to James and to the apostles and to the 12 and to 500 believers, and then also to Paul as one untimely born. Walk us a little bit through how you got interested in studying how memory relates to believing in the resurrection and in the Gospels in general.
Yep. Yeah, actually, I was probably more interested in Jesus' resurrection, and it felt like most of the things had been done. Actually, so I can see got Michael Lacona's book behind me, which is great, and I'd still stand behind his approach and the way he does it. Yeah, but as I was interested in getting to academia and wanting to do a PhD, you need something novel, something new to study and to look at. Yep. And so the criteria of authenticity, which is generally what people like Gary Habermas, Lacona, Graieg, Wright had used, was being criticized. And some people had said that's the end of it. And then some people have said, hey, memory could be a way forward. And so it was actually Andrew Loke, who I was living in Singapore at the time. He said you should just do a memory approach to Jesus' resurrection, basically. Yes, he suggested it was great. I wrote to several different Bible college seminaries, unis, and some of them were like, oh, what's your perspective on this? And they're like, no, we don't want a conservative viewpoint on this. Some said, like, great, but we don't have anyone who's able to supervise it. There was someone who said the topic's too hard. Super happily, that person actually went on to endorse my book. So it's
great.
Kind of nice to say it got through.
Which is Remembering Resurrection, right? If people want to pick it up, it's a Routledge edition.
Published with Routledge. On my bookshelf.
It's got a great, colorful title, like many of the monographs that they end up publishing. So if anyone wants to get a copy, I do remember seeing how expensive it is, though. So you may need to put it on a birthday or a Christmas wish list whenever you get these monographs through a qualified academic publisher. It tends to be an expensive one to be able to pick up. But yeah, wander us through some of your sort of research approach, and then maybe some of your findings and how memory pertains to the reliability of sort of the apostolic witness to the resurrection and then beyond.
Yep. So I do not have an undergraduate or master's or degree in either psychology of like memory or in like philosophy of memory. So I did it actually in engineering and then in theology and then a New Testament PhD. And so I, in some sense, wasn't preset on like what memory would indicate this. And I tried my best to research it. But obviously, there's still stuff I haven't covered, which, you know, other people are looking to and find out more. But in general, I found there was roughly 21 factors, which is probably like overkill, actually, but that could have some impact on it. I'd say there's another like 10 or 20 factors in memory, but I didn't necessarily say they were immediately relevant. Like you could say like childhood memory, and someone's like, hey, that could be relevant. So like, yeah, you could go into looking at that a bit more. But yeah, so of these factors, then I basically try to understand them and say, you know, what are they, and then just do what, and that's like understand in its own right. So like, what do psychologists say? What do philosophers say? Yep. And then it's just trying to apply it to particularly Jesus' resurrection in 1 Corinthians and say like, what would be the implications? And I think some of them tend to give us good assurance that this is probably well remembered. Things like the closeness of the event as opposed to it being like 100 years later or something like this. Things like it being called a flashbulb memory, where it's a more significant, emotionally involving event. But yeah, there are things that may cause questions as well, like whether it's things like suggestions. You could say, hey, could that have caused them to have a false memory or distorted view of it and stuff like that.
Yeah, memory gets retold over time, and people are like, "Oh, is that really how it happened?" And you can see a story that gets told, particularly by people again and again on film or camera or recording, how the story sometimes just adapts slightly over time, and that ends up being for them what feels like a genuine memory, but it has almost through just the process of retelling taken on a different flavor. So that's super interesting. Well, what I want to do is play a bit of a clip from a Flagrant podcast. So one of our mutual friends, Wes Huff, was on Flagrant a number of months back, and right around the same time, the comedians on the panel actually interviewed Alex O'Connor, who would be one of the better known sort of atheist figureheads, but just a really reasonable guy asking good questions, representing some critical scholarship, and usually just raising great points that Christians can go and investigate, think about, obviously raising doubts as well that are worth digging into. But on here, he shares a bit of a perspective around one reason why he doubts that the stories told about Jesus's words in the Gospels are really true. And I just think it's helpful to hear it. Now, if you go and watch the full podcast, actually 2 volumes of a podcast, 2 episodes with the Flagrant guys and Alex, it's pretty funny in that they're probably not used to having on a philosopher of his kind of skill or particular tact. And you can see a lot of the Alex O'Connor fans in the comments section just making some hilarious comments about Alex being constantly interrupted and looking like a deer trapped in headlights when it comes just the banter back and forth. I particularly love this one. This is from Danielle4263, where she said, "Put the Flagrant crew on the tracks and the whole comment section would pull the lever." So Alex is talking about the trolley problem in there. Yeah. Everyone's like, we just let's ditch them and just listen to Alex. I thought that was good fun. But we're going to listen to a short clip of him discussing more particularly this idea about the memory, how it pertains to the disciples, whether or not they'd be able to remember Jesus's words decades later. So let's listen, and then I'm going to get your reactions to it.
Early language of Christ had different like oral tradition that then when it was translated into Greek, some of those things got lost.
Yeah, so that's really important too, is that Jesus spoke Aramaic. So this is something I always find incredibly interesting when people are really hanging on every word that Jesus said. Okay, you guys are listening very carefully to what I'm saying, right? You paying attention?
Yeah.
Can any of you recite, excluding this one, the last sentence I just said? Just tell me the last sentence.
I'm still trying to pronounce Latruna or whatever. That depression medication you were telling us about. Yeah, okay, wow. So
side effects include visions of God.
Yeah. So, okay, wow, yes. So obviously there's going to be some...
You can't remember the words that I said to you 20 seconds ago, but I'm expected to believe that the New Testament authors who were writing, at best, decades after the death of Jesus, could remember his exact words and write them down accurately in a language that he wasn't speaking.
In a language that he wasn't speaking, is
no way, man. Now, what's important to note there, though, is that like if I said something really particular, like if I were talking to you, and then I suddenly said, you know, I'm a famous songwriter or something, that might stick in your memory, such that in like a month or 2 you could remember that I said that because it was important. So if Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am," that's the kind of thing that people could remember.
This is my body.
Exactly, but like the "I am" thing. Like, oh, well, he was quoting the Old Testament. Okay, so we've got a Greek rendition Well, actually, when we say it in English, we're using an English translation of a Greek text, quoting an Aramaic-speaking man, allegedly quoting a Hebrew scripture.
Yeah.
There are a lot of chains of transmission that we have to investigate and see what's.
And I might have
actually going on
misunderstood you, but 40 years later at the earliest, I
there.
don't.
Is when it's written down.
If I'm quoting something you said last week, I don't know.
Yeah.
Some people think that John's Gospel is earlier. So John's Gospel tends to be dated to 90 to 100 AD. Some people date it earlier because there's one verse in John's Gospel, John chapter 5. It opens up by saying, "Now there is a pool by the sheep's gate." And it says, "At this pool, this is what happened." But John says there is a pool. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And so if John's writing his gospel, and this isn't like Jesus
He's writing in real time.
he says, "Now there is a sheep's gate near the pool." If that sheep gate had been destroyed, then why would he have written it like that? So some people, for that reason, put John pre-70.
All right, then I'm going to leave it there. I'm keen to get your immediate reaction, but let me maybe just spell out a little bit of what Alex has just kind of said. He's like, look, let's say Jesus is talking 30 AD, the upper room discourse in John's Gospel. At best, John's Gospel is written just before 70 AD. The vast majority of both critical and conservative scholarship is all going to be putting it 80s, 90s AD. The other Gospels, whether early dating from mid 50s to mid 60s for the synoptics and through to John later, but the critical scholarship, 70 AD for Mark, 80, 85 AD for Matthew and Luke, and then John in the 90s. So no matter how you look at it, you've got decades between what Jesus says and it getting written down. And Alex is just sitting there on the couch going, man, you guys can't even remember a sentence I said 20 seconds ago. How on earth do we meant to think that the apostles can remember Jesus's words from decades before? What's your general reaction to what feels like a pretty natural skepticism? I mean, how do we really trust that these red letter words capture Jesus's original conversations? How would you respond just immediately off the bat?
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot going on there and there's different issues. I can comment, I haven't seen the full clip myself, actually. So yeah.
Well, that's about
my
it
first-
in that section. There's
Yep,
not much
yep.
more about the memory side of things from there because they just go off into other topics.
Yep. Yeah. So a few things I'd say is the idea that we just, like if you're saying can't remember 20 seconds ago, it depends what you mean by that, which is to say, if you want to say, hey, so we just can't remember anything, well then, like, how do we know that Alex said that? Well, like, how does he continue his train of thought? So we, in general, have to assume a basic reliability of memory to use memory. And any argument you make about why memory is unreliable uses memory that you can remember the premises and you can remember that it's unreliable. So it would be undermining. So there's a sense in which, in that basic sense, yeah, you can't just do away with memory that easily. And I also want to point out that in general, the fact that we forget stuff is part of normal, healthy human memory. And so there are people who, I mean, I guess you sort of say post-traumatic stress disorder and other things like that. So people who can't forget, that is a problem in life. And so I don't know about you, if you've had more than one phone number or more than one address, if you are unable to forget that, you may find yourself driving to the wrong home and calling the wrong number and all these things. So the fact that we forget is healthy human memory. So that's not. And so, yeah, there's studies that say off the top of my head that we forget like 80% or more of what happens, but of that, then 20% that we do remember, they're saying we generally do remember that like with 90% accuracy. So like certain well. And then, yeah, you got to talk about difference between ultra short-term memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, and stuff like that. So there'd be different categories of that. Like I know you mentioned
this
the date.
sounds like some of the features that you were talking about, the 21 elements of memory that are pertinent to studying the resurrection kind of accounts in 1 Corinthians 15 and the tradition that's there. You're saying some of these pertain to kind of what Alex is talking about and act almost on controls to say, memory can be good or memory can be bad, and it depends on the conditions as to which one of those two things it is. It may be a person's brain. A person may not have, like my mum, for instance, significant brain damage, and so faculties of her memory have been heavily damaged from an accident. It may be that some people have worked out that muscle more than others, and they're actually good at developing memory. And you think of guys solving Rubik's Cube or something like that because they're able to memorize the patterns and the movements and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of, I guess, these control features, and it'd be great to maybe dig down into the ones that you think don't match the conditions that he set out. So sitting on a couch, you can't remember the sentence I said 20 seconds ago. How are we meant to remember Jesus's words from decades before? What are the things that are different between the situation with Jesus's disciples and then Alex's conversation with the flagrant crew on the couch? Now, some Christians have responded to this, and I saw someone get beat up for it. They kind of quote what Jesus says in John. So in John 14, Jesus says, hey, don't worry, I'm going to send a counselor, the Holy Spirit. He will lead you into all truth and will bring to remembrance the words that I've said to you. And so there's a Christian saying, well, Alex, I can answer this easily. Like the Holy Spirit, man, he's the one that reminds the disciples of Jesus's words. He's the one that helps inspire these New Testament books. And that might be a satisfying answer if you're already a Christian. Like you've got these explanatory resources to kind of draw into in more of a supernatural worldview. But purely from a naturalistic perspective, it'd be good to parse out, are there differences between the world of the apostles and the experience of the early church community in holding on to these memories and developing these oral traditions, as to the situation with Alex on the couch with a bunch of comedians, just to try and draw analogy and disanalogy where we can. So yeah, maybe let's start with one that you think is pertinent and we can dig down and then go to some others.
Yeah, got you. Again, there's several things that can be said, which is to say, if, like, God forbid, during that interview, they suddenly had something crazy happen, like the ceiling collapsed or someone came in to like assault them, I think their emotions would be aroused. It'd be unusual, and then they probably will remember that like very well.
Was that the flashbulb kind of memory that you spoke about, or flashpoint memory that you spoke about?
Yeah, basically, yes. Yep.
So some experience that's unexpected or really morally serious or weighty for you helps you remember that. Would that be akin to something like, getting married, where it's such a significant day that you tend to have a lot of memories even decades later without having to recount it often? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yes, yeah, that's sort of the basic thing. Let's just say, you don't remember, every time you saw your spouse, but there certain ones that stood out more. The same as you may not remember every breakfast you had, but you may remember an anniversary one or your birthday breakfast or something like that. Yeah. Other factors, I'm just so much to go in there, was one he brought up was from the different languages. And actually, I'm just trying to think which order we want to go through this, but yeah, brought that up now. Let's continue. I did actually, if you like a 20-second factor, actually research memory of foreign languages, but I guess I already had enough factors, and that one got cut. Yep, I would hope one day to actually turn it in a journal article, but as someone who has arguably 6 part-time jobs, I just don't find the extra time,
to do all of that.
To do this. But
let this be an advertisement to anyone wanting to go into the area of theology and philosophy and stuff like that, and just realizing how sometimes the career options aren't as sturdy as you might wish them to be. Yeah,
it has been tougher than I wanted, but I think if I see myself as like retired, I'm like living the dream. This is great. So.
That's amazing. But that's kind of a significant one in terms of the other languages, because we do have within the Greek Gospels. So if you're new, the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are penned in Greek, but we do have like these almost memories preserved in Jesus's original Aramaic words, where rather than translating from his mother tongue Aramaic into Greek, they've just transliterated and left the Aramaic phrases in there. So like Talitha cum in Mark's gospel, where he says, little girl, I say to you, rise. And so that must have been a particularly potent memory for the apostles, that rather than translating Jesus's words, they're just quoting from memory this raw experience. Or Jesus's famous cry of dereliction on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, in that, my God, why have you forsaken me, kind of quoting. And so they've got some of Jesus's original words there in Aramaic, but it does seem like they've been happy to translate the rest of his conversations with them into Greek rather than preserving it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And so it ended up not making it into my PhD and book, because while some people say the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 could have been original Aramaic, I think the version that we have, they would say like that was a Greek original. It's not a translation, and it may well have originally been Greek as well. So hence there was just no relevance for that. But yeah, so I guess I'm kind of cheating here because I'm drawing from studies conclusions that are not publicly available. But I would say the evidence that I was seeing was that people can remember crossover in different languages and memories well. So that wouldn't be a reason to undermine it. So it's not that you have the exact correspondence words, but just the concept, like the category of, like, that Jesus rose, whether it's said in Greek or Aramaic, all those things can carry over fairly well in memory and studies of that. In fact, some of them have actually argued that people who do speak multiple language have better memories. It's like got encoded in two different sections, and so it's less likely to be but you can argue these factors,
there's good arguments that at least some of Jesus's apostles had that multilingual capacity. So whether it's Matthew operating with his tax collector role and interacting with the kind of Roman authorities that he's serving, is he only speaking Aramaic, or is he doing most of his written record work in Greek? Whether it's the conversations between Jesus and Pilate, and there's no mention of a translator or anything in there. How would Jesus communicate with Pontius Pilate, who would have a Latin-speaking background but would be very, very familiar with Greek, but probably not with Aramaic? And the fact that he records Jesus's name, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in the three languages, both in Greek and in Aramaic and in Latin, for the sign above the cross. You're like, well, that's a good window of how they're traversing multiple languages here. And so some have argued that maybe Jesus even spoke some rudimentary Greek, particularly from his job being able to work in Greek-speaking cities nearby Nazareth, like Sepphoris or in the Decapolis and stuff. I've even seen Peter Williams, and I mentioned this in a recent video about the name of Jesus, but Peter Williams arguing, based on the language of Matthew 5-7, that Jesus sometimes taught in Greek. And so he said he can identify in the Greek text a whole range of, whether it's alliteration or Greek-speaking puns that cannot translate over into Aramaic, that you're either saying Jesus didn't teach these words and a Greek speaker has invented it, or you're saying perhaps Jesus had given this sermon in Greek, if not in multiple languages in different places at different times as he's teaching. And so you're like, there's interesting features there too, that some of what Jesus was saying may have been in Aramaic, some may have been in Greek. It does seem like where Jesus is from, it's a far greater resistance to Hellenization in most of the rural areas of the Galilee, but they are, again, near some Greek cities. And certainly we have Philip in the Gospels, one of Jesus's 12 disciples, being approached by the Greek speakers who want to see Jesus in John chapter 12. And so, it's just some interesting features in there about language and memory. And that's interesting, though. Like it kind of maps onto what I would expect with people who can speak multiple languages, maybe having a stronger sense of memory, because you're having to heighten different tools to draw from, particularly when it's remembering enough vocabulary words to be able to do that. So you're training your memory in a sense.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with all you said. I would say there's, in my reading at least of it, there's a shift in the scholarship where, a few decades ago they would have said, just spoke Aramaic, and now it's more like bilingual or multilingual. As you described. I mean, another point to raise from the video, and what you said was someone saying, why not just John 14, the Holy Spirit brings to mind? So I mean, you could say that, and if that's the case, then that in a sense would guarantee it. And they might just say, is like that just begging the question, a circular argument? We know that because it says that. It would be more like the presupposition of, like, if that were the case, as it follows. So in a sense, it may not be apologetically useful, or be hard to falsify, but I do think, like, it's logically coherent and consistent.
Another way of taking a whole video out there, David, if I could just pause. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just on that point, I think it's important. So Dan McClellan, who I think does some really interesting scholarship here and there, and certainly would come, though, from more of a skeptical point of view when it comes to traditional Christianity. And I just think that's probably a fair commentary on the nature of his work, trying to draw scholarly insights about the study of the Bible that he thinks are at odds with the claims of traditional Christianity. And so he made a response video to, I think, a well-meaning content creator who had come on and said, look, we can easily explain this, Alex. Jesus just said the Holy Spirit will bring to remembrance his words. And Dan took umbrage to that. And I get it. From a critical standpoint, you're not really offering any substantive reason to trust memory is reliable, other than a supernatural presupposition. But for what you're saying is, well, it's not really begging the question, like Dan charges in that video that he did on it, because you're not assuming the reliability of the memory to begin with. You're simply saying this is an explanatory point. If Christianity is true, then this is how you could explain that memory would be reliably preserved over decades. Now, I tend to think there's just other ways to engage on the critical footing, and that's what you're encouraging is like, hey, well, let's just start where the Dan McClellans and the Alex O'Connors are with just saying, critically speaking, looking at human memory and the environmental factors of early Christianity, do we have reasons to think that maybe the Gospels do preserve the right red letters, that these could be the words that Jesus shared? And that's more where I was wanting to go with this video. And I've actually done a video on this myself as a bit more of a noob, in that people can check it out on the channel, just exploring good memory. I'll put a link down in the description below, just looking at maybe 5 environmental factors. But I'm curious more to hear from your research, which of these sort of features of memory do you think give us most reason for hope that the apostles could have reliably preserved Jesus's words? So we've looked at a couple so far, like how language works. We've looked at these sort of flashpoint memories. Are there other key factors that you think contribute?
Yep. Yeah. Happy to do it as well. Just to jump back on the John 14 one. Another thing, actually, it was in like the draft of my PhD, and it made the cutting floor as well, was William Lane Craig has a journal article called something like Men Moved by the Spirit, a Middle Knowledge Perspective on the Inspiration of Scripture. And so he basically says you can have like a supernatural explanation of God inspired, like almost like a dictation style. Not that that's generally what Christians take, but you could take that view. Or he says it could just be that God so knew what a Peter was like, and if Peter went through certain situations, like this is how he would react, right? And so you could say the same thing about the gospel orders, like a Mark, if he has certain life experiences at school, like his education, like his memory practice, his writing practice, and the experiences, he would just freely write this. And so it occurred to me that you could say the same thing about memory. You could say the same thing that if you had a God knew what Paul like in certain free situations, not determining, but he could also say that he would naturally remember this, that type of person. Like I want someone who would remember that. So again, that's to say that doesn't invoke a supernatural, like brings to mind way, but it's saying people have gone through these situations that an omniscient God would know, could also order it such that people would just freely remember accurately and rightly as well.
Yeah, so that would be maybe another theological explanation. So if we were to say alongside the John 14 around the Holy Spirit helping to bring to memory the words of Jesus for the apostles, this would be another theological explanation that God makes sure that the red letters are the words of Jesus by providentially ordering creation through middle knowledge, counterfactual knowledge of what people would do in various circumstances, ensures that what eventually gets recorded by the gospel authors really does match up with the words of Jesus. So again, that maybe is a useful theological explanation, but would be one that Alex and Dan McClellan might, well, just throw out from the beginning, just given the standpoint. They're like, no, I'm just trying to though understand this from a critical, naturalistic perspective. Can we explain this through other features? So we've given a couple so far. Let's just keep wandering through and see if there's any more that you think are highly relevant.
Yep. Yeah. Depends on the individual. I think in general with memory, you're going to go with the further away it was, the harder it is to remember, and basically all sides. I mean, we said some memories, like flashbulb memories, are more memorable than others. But yeah, even I guess, again, if you're recalling a flashbulb memory a year from now or a decade from now or 50 years from now, it'll make a difference. So that's a factor. And so I would say, I didn't write on this, and I'm not trying to toss out part of the Bible, but yeah, you know, if you date John in the 90s, it would make it, all things being equal, would have potentially more memory difficulties and issues and open to distortions or stuff like that than if Mark's gospel is written in the 70s, something like that. And I guess that's where you talked about the dating, and it can come to a verse like there is a sheep. That was Alex, not you. There you go. I'm already conflating the sources who said it. But like that, if people dated, you know,
so the
John
earlier
in the 60s,
dating of John's gospel would be helpful.
Yeah, for instance, it would be. But I guess on the whole, then, I would say that may be theologically interesting, like for us as Christians to decide, you know, do we have the very words of Jesus? Yep. But apologetically speaking, and I guess even for skeptics to say, like, to prove Christianity false, you know, it's going to come down to Jesus' death and resurrection. So whether or not, you know, it was rightly remembered that Jesus said, say, the parable of the Good Samaritan, right?
Or the high priestly
Yep.
prayer or something. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think, there could be reasons to affirm that. I believe that. Yep. But if someone said, no, like it's false, I can show this, like it's very likely memory distortion because of some like suggestion or blah, blah, blah. Yep. But I'd basically say, yeah, but if we've got memory that Jesus rose from the dead, like it almost just doesn't matter. And I'd say that's what you need to deal with as well. And then, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, you've got, within 20 years, the memory of Jesus' death and resurrection. And then most people say it's got an earlier tradition that dates to within perhaps months. Some people said, like James D.G. Young, or others have said, not more than a decade. And in either case, then that's like very close and fresh.
Very early.
Yeah. And also really not talking about just one person's memory in the sense they might say, well, it's just Paul in 1 Corinthians. But the idea, he said he received this, he passed on, and then he says, this is what all the apostles are teaching and believing. So, yeah, I'd say that you kind of have game, set, and match with memory of Jesus' resurrection.
Yeah, so your
regardless
point here is let's just take away inerrancy. And maybe some of the Gospels aren't correct in the words that they say or ascribe to Jesus. Let's even take away the inspiration of all of the New Testament. Even if you could dint those two things, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity at its fundamental phase is still true. And so you're kind of locating the importance of this question and just saying this shouldn't be something that undermines confidence in Christianity as a whole. This is more just a question of, can we have confidence that all the words of Jesus in the Gospels really do reflect what he originally said in his original language, or are a reasonable facsimile thereof, rather than people inserting words to his lips. So that's like helpful just in terms of ordering where this conversation fits. Maybe there's a couple of things I'd love to throw your way. So let's talk about the dating of the Gospels. Who's to say that we have this written record today that we call the Gospel of John, Mark, Matthew, Luke? Who's to say that the contents of those Gospels aren't based off prior written testimony? So one of the features that's interesting about, for instance, The Chosen as a TV series that's being done right now is you've kind of got this character, Matthew, or Levi, the tax collector, and becomes a follower of Jesus. He comes from a background where he obviously has on the spectrum with ASD, and personality struggles to fit in with everyone. But from the beginning, he just starts taking notes. What you would describe as maybe sermon notes or field reports of everything that's happening, that as they go on in the story, eventually he composes decades later into his gospel. So he's taken all his prior written notes, maybe scrawled the sayings of the Lord, maybe written in the Hebrew dialect, who knows? But as that gets composed into a final form in the Greek, how do we know that the disciples are just remembering decades later to write the Gospels rather than working from notes that had been taken along the way?
Yeah, that actually was like another 23rd factor. That was something I looked into and considered, but I'd say there's at least in 1 Corinthians 15, we don't have any earlier text version of it. And so, yeah, it also is the cutting room floor. But you're right, it has relevance to other parts of the New Testament. Yeah, and I was thinking, I haven't seen all The Chosen, but yeah, I've seen like the episode with the Sermon on the Mount where Matthew's helping like draft it up and writing it down.
It's just interesting in that regard, because it just helps us think. It's like, all right, we're dealing with probabilities that someone's going to remember reliably. And one of the features are, well, how do we know that it wasn't recorded earlier, and that the Gospels, particularly when you've got sources like Q that is used within the synoptic problem to try and figure out where did Matthew and Luke get their shared source material from? Like, how do we know that there's not early source material of the words of Jesus and the sayings of the Lord that have been preserved that at the time of the writing of the Gospels, but that never survived this 1st or 2nd century beyond that? It's like where I'm writing a sermon and I've got draft notes and I throw them out, when I'm done with the final sermon. Could that be a feature that plays as well into the early stages of Gospels?
Yeah, so I do think that's a possibility, but basically until more has been found, maybe the stuff written, which I'm not aware of, which is often the case, but I would say it's also probably a little bit speculative right now would say, yep, if they had these earlier written sources, it would then make us closer and give us more reliability. But yeah, until we've got stronger reason to think that, it's not. I know you sort of alluded to Papias' saying, and actually I can see I've got Richard Borkham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses behind me that does discuss that passage, and like, how could it be Matthew's first? Like, was there a Aramaic original and
pre-Matthew
stuff like
got pre-Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah.
Because we know the
all
Gospel
of
of Matthew
that's
we currently have
possibilities.
is definitely constructed in Greek. But if for those who are just catching on, Papias, who was an apostolic father based in Hierapolis, he had a 5-volume set on Jesus that we don't have. And so we're talking about the apostolic tradition that he received, but we have a whole lot of quotes, particularly in Eusebius, of this earlier tradition from later church fathers. It'd be the one thing that if we dug up anything from the sands, man, I would love it to be Papias's 5-volume set, because being so close, sort of end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, having direct contact with John in the region, just be fascinating to kind of see what historical insights he'd be able to add. But when he comments on the 2 gospels that he was aware of at the time, with both Matthew and Mark, he speaks about Matthew being written first and it uses a phraseology of like the Hebrew dialect. And people are like, what does that mean? Is that in Hebrew thought form, and the whole Matthew being a Hebrew gospel, it's written as it is written to answer the Hebrew scriptures, or is this actually in the Hebrew language? And well, that's a copy that we don't have then, because ours is definitely written in Greek. So there's just controversy around what is the Matthew's gospel that Papias is specifically referring to. But I just think the idea that there could be notes that were left. But the other one is just how, like, what's the difference between our culture and a highly oral culture when it comes to memory? In that I just pull out my smartphone now, and either ChatGPT or Claude or Grok or Google can answer pretty much any of my questions. All of my friends' phone numbers are stored for me in the contacts app, so I don't have to remember anyone's phone number like I did as a kid. Everyone's addresses, I just type it into Google. I don't have to remember where I'm driving anymore in order to kind of locate myself in the world. GBS has taken over. We live in a technological society that has repurposed our mind and our ability to do memory stuff. But is it viable to say that an oral culture could keep detailed memories alive for decades?
Yes. So, I mean, that's also an issue. And the general sort of viewpoint, I think I would say, oral cultures, you practice your memory. Yes, you're going to remember things more. Like even today, we have modern memory championships. And actually, I did just look this up yesterday, so I'm cheating here. But people have memorized pi to 70,000 decimals. Like that's the world record. So 70,000
by memory, or is there a formula to work that out?
That
is wild.
Yeah, I mean it's but it's crazy, right? So even today, like if people practice, they can do that, and there are memory techniques. It's generally like you sit at like a room and you tell a story, like remembering and stuff like this, and that's an ancient technique copied from probably the Greeks, but yeah.
But that's interesting to me, because like when I first became a Christian, I was encouraged to try and memorize parts of the Bible. And I have been so well served by that encouragement, in that there are literally hundreds of verses now in the NIV that at the drop of a hat, I could call to memory and quote verbatim. And my wife will tell you, I can't remember to put the kids' homework in their school bag. I can't remember important dates for other things, because I'm not good at exercising my memory in those areas. But in some things, my memory, whether it's movie quotes for Robin Hood, the Mel Brooks kind of spoof version of it, whether it's biblical passages, whether it's lyrics from songs, man, I can remember unbelievably well. But there are just other aspects where I'm terrible. So you can notice within yourself the ability to train your memory and to preserve huge amounts of data verbatim as a result. So I find that interesting.
Yeah. But in addition to that, I'd also just want to say, so yes, there was like training for old cultures. That was something they did, and they valued that. But the studies have done of often been that oral cultures say, we know these epics like verbatim exactly, and then they get them to do like a few hour recordings, and then they do it again, and they're not verbatim in a sense, which I would say it's probably no surprise. But that being said, they are the general gist of it, which in a sense is all that really matters. So even then they claim, yeah, we know this exactly, they don't, but they do know it close enough. Yeah, and people were like, in some sense, amazed though of these abilities. And they turned around and actually said that we have like amazing memories too. Like if you ask your sort of average guy, like tell us about like Michael Jordan's sports statistics or stuff like this. Do you remember that event from like decades ago and stuff like that? People can tell you like, all the current rosters of like random football teams and stuff like that. And so people actually do have these amazing feats of memory. It's just they're not interested in remembering these sort of ancient stories and that. There's something else that gets their attention.
Yeah, but I've even got a friend who performed the entire Gospel of Mark.
Yep.
So, being able to summarize the whole contents of Jesus's teaching and repeat them verbatim in the English translation that they were using. And you're like, so it is possible to train your memory to preserve that. And it seems to me that the early church may have had some features that really celebrate this too. Like you read in Acts chapter 2, for instance, 2:42, that the church had everything together in one accord. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the prayers. And this devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, sort of this formal hint of them memorizing what they were being told from the apostles. And you consider then you go to like Acts chapter 5, where you get the appointing of deacons within the church, and interesting stories in chapter 6 and 7 with the follow-on of that. But the reason being for the appointing of the deacons, so that the apostles could devote themselves to the ministry of the word, the spreading of the word of the Lord, and that they would go from house to house, town to town, place to place, repeating the testimony of what they'd heard Jesus say and what they'd seen him do, as well as their being eyewitnesses to his resurrection. And one of the things I found interesting, just about Alex on the couch, he's like, well, how are they meant to remember what Jesus said 30 years ago? And you're like, well, it's not that they haven't talked about it for 30 years. It's not that they're digging up a memory that's ancient and that they've kind of long lost forgotten and going, oh yeah, let me see if I can now recount his words. It's like, well, no, they're reinforcing this memory every single day by retelling these stories and conversations in order to spread that around. And that just seems to me to be a really powerful control mechanism on the stories, where you are doing constant repetition. Because there are some stories in my teaching that I have to retell because they're really impactful in my life. And what's interesting about noticing now, whenever I'm in the process of telling these stories, I might adapt them to be able to give more detail or less detail based on time. But there is particular phrases that for me capture my feelings and that I repeat probably in a dozen places on recording, where you might be like, wow, he's basically telling the same story. And all of that's from memory, but just because of the pattern of repetition as well, you kind of help anchor that in your memory. And I wonder whether that's one of the features that's playing into what's happening amongst the New Testament community as well, where the apostles are recounting these stories often enough that rather than being ancient memories, they're pretty fresh. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I basically agree with that. Those are the kind of factors in Luke chapter 1, where I'm going to butcher this on top of my head, but Luke says like he interviewed these people and these were like servants of the word. Yeah, so I think some studies on that suggested there may have been people who basically memorized these traditions, passed them on, they like taught them. Even in, again, 1 Corinthians 15, how the creed, Paul says it's of first importance. So actually that's an English translation of that. And actually I would say one thing actually I made a mistake, if you like, in my book is I think I do put it as first importance. And if you read James Ware, I'd say it's better, the final triumph of God. And he says it's really of first things. And so this is like the first things that they were taught. I mean, it's also important as such, but I think the emphasis he rightly says is, it's like the first things that people were taught. Yeah. And this could be part of like catechesis, or like you want to become a Christian, this is what you get taught. Yeah. This is something that Paul received, and it's like people are handing it on. There's designated teachers in the church as well. Yep.
Yeah, and I that was one of the features that just, for me, it's like, well, let's look exactly at what's happening. You've got people devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching. You've got the apostles teaching this again and again and again. And it's not that you've got one source for these conversations. I mean, there are sometimes only one or two people present. And we have to ask the question, how do we know what happened in the conversation between Jesus and Pilate? Is that like where we get the window from the wife of the of Chusa, the servant of King Herod. And you're like, well, is she the origin of the information from the inside of Herod's household and what happens with Herod and Herodias and the beheading of John the Baptist and the conversation that takes place with Jesus? You're trying to find sources for this. But for most of Jesus's teaching, it's like, well, you've got at least the apostles, if not also the women followers of Jesus, his female disciples, if not also various other people that are present, the sisters of Lazarus or the crowds that gather for his teaching. You've got a lot of sources for this that are pretty motivated to get this right. I remember in the video that I did, I'm curious on whether you think this is a decent analogy, because people often will raise the telephone game as a problem for the oral memory or stories of Jesus's words being preserved. And they'll say, one kid passes on a message to another kid. That kid invariably gets it wrong or muddles with it to try and make it more funny, tells the next kid something hilarious, usually involving poos or wheeze or toilets or something like that. And by the end of the line, when it gets read out loud, the original message has been completely lost in translation. And people are like, surely that's what's happening.
The purple monkey dishwasher.
Yeah. But that's exactly what's happening with the Gospels. And I'm thinking, I just, again, don't think that's analogous, because imagine if, and you set this control of motivations, imagine if in playing the telephone game, I said to the first kid and to everyone present, hey, if you guys get this right and the message gets preserved from the beginning to the end, everyone in the room will get $100. Wow, that's a big motivation for the kids to carefully pass on and preserve the message from the beginning to the end. And because it's such a high stakes game now, all of a sudden, they're going to be highly motivated to make sure that they're careful in passing it on, careful in receiving it, memorizing it, careful in passing it on, receiving, memorizing all the way to the end. And I just think that high stakes motivation is exactly what comes into play too with the teaching about Jesus. If eternity is on the line and that he is the only one that offers resurrection unto eternal life as the solution to the wages of sin, which is death. If he's the only one offering salvation in this sense, it strikes me that people would be highly motivated to want to pass on those words carefully, that they wouldn't be flippant in their attitudes or lack care, but the early church would have preserved his words with great care to try and do that. Do you reckon that's maybe another factor, like just into the motivations, what's driving people, whether or not we think that plays into it?
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. Yes, and I wouldn't want to play a kids game of telephone with punishments, but likewise, if you had like persecution as like if you get it wrong, something like this, I think that also motivate it. And I guess you've generally got that context of persecution within the early church. I know the whole question about the martyrs, there's different spectrums. Like Sean McDowell's work is good on this and others. But I'd also point to in 1 Corinthians 15 again, we have double evidence of this. We've got Paul talking about how he fought wild beasts in Ephesus, which, it's again in my book, I said it's probably metaphorical with the majority of scholars. But I'd say go read James Ware, The Final Triumph of God, argues that no, the language is literal. Again, and I mean, if you didn't take that, other reasons to think that they're telling the truth is there's been a PhD dissertation done last year by Kaldi Peroski at Asbury, who talks about testimony in the Greco-Roman world, in the Jewish world, and what likely lays behind 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, if Christ has not been ways, we've been found to be false witnesses of God. And she argues for a Jewish background laying behind Paul's words, which they're basically saying, we would be lying to God, and we believe, that's a sin, you shall not lie. Like, we could be sent, in a sense, to hell for this. So, we're standing by this. The standard is 2 or 3 witnesses, and that's why we've got that. He appeared to, Peter, to the 12, to James, to all the apostles, and 500 stuff. So you've got multiple. It's more than above and beyond the standard. You've got a context of persecution. Like the telephone game said, it's not just one person. It's a web, a net, a chain that's going out. And that's definitely what Bart Ehrman likes to say. Like he says, do you know how Mark ended up writing down the Gospel of Mark? It was because he heard it from his wife, who heard it from the neighbor who was on a business trip and heard it from some random salesperson who told their nephews, uncles, brother, and so
17
how would
points
you
of
even know?
separation. Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
again, I would say
Which just doesn't map onto, again, the early church testimony for the Gospel of Mark specifically, where it was Papias and then others after him who said that Mark was Peter's interpreter, who was capturing the contents of Peter's apostolic preaching. I can see you reaching for another book, trying to channel your inner Wes Huff.
Yeah, so I would say, Richard Baucham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses is a better likely model for how the Gospels came to be. Particularly talks about Mark and Peter and the source, and not just from the tradition, but there being evidence within the Gospel itself.
And when we're trying to do a timeline and then where this happens, and this is why, again, dating is going to come into the conversation. An earlier dating for the Gospels will make this more significant. A later dating will make this less significant. But certainly you've got the feature that if the earlier dating is true of Mark somewhere in the 50s, maybe early, mid, late 50s, of Luke and Matthew being in the 60s, particularly earlier phases before the death of Peter and the death of Paul and the death of James, and then you've got John somewhere, either just before AD 70 or even later. For the majority of the gospel content, you've still got apostles alive doing a teaching ministry when these gospels are first penned and then beginning to circulate. And so if there are contents in the gospels that don't align with what genuinely happened, you've got apostolic custodians, let's say, who are going to be holding it to account, or at least saying, actually, that's not exactly how it happened, or wanting to fact check what was written in these gospels. So I think the earlier dating is significant there, and it's important to look at the source material of what happened to the apostles. For those who are maybe interested in checking this out, we have a video on the channel, one that explores the fate of the apostles and certainly what the early sources say with relative reliability, what we can say about whether they were martyred, whether they died, where they died, the disagreements in the sources around half of the apostles. But another one that explores what did they do while they were alive, which is where did they go? Who did they speak to? What churches did they have influences on? What disciples did they make that we can track back through the meaningful tradition? And I just think that's important to kind of take into account that a lot of them, if we're talking mid 50s to early 60s, even into the 70s, were still around, still alive, still doing preaching of the gospel of Jesus during that era, that would have been able to preserve reliably if the gospels included false testimony, were putting false words into Jesus's lips, were portraying him in a way that wasn't true to what they knew. These are guys that are highly motivated to tell the truth. They are willing to suffer for the claims of what they saw, both in this life and in the life beyond. They've got those motivations to preserve the truth carefully. And I just think that's just worth keeping a note. Now, it could be entirely true that one of these was written in Alexandria and the remaining living apostles were in Ephesus or in Achaia or in Corinth or somewhere, and therefore not going to see it in their lifetime. But still, the willingness to write it down and spread it amongst Christian communities, knowing there are living apostles, takes some pretty big kahunas if you're inventing the details or kind of making it up, knowing that it could get a bit of an apostolic smackdown. So I just find those features not determinative, but it's interesting when you start adding up what you've talked about, like these flashbulb memories of significantly either emotionally significant or surprising events that just anchor in your memory better, of the retelling again and again and again, of the careful motivations to want to preserve what is true and having the right character within the community to kind of do that. Of an extended oral tradition and a memory that feeds into this, of living apostles at the end act as custodians. You start stacking some of these factors up, and it doesn't say, yep, every red letter then is entirely reliable from a critical standpoint, but it does say, well, maybe there's good reason to say it's plausible. It's at least plausible that the apostolic community in this way could preserve the words of Jesus. Would you feel like that's a fair or accurate assessment of things?
Yeah, no, I do think that is. And I guess I want to say apologetically, we don't require it. And if we needed a case for Jesus' resurrection, I do think that's not just plausible, that's like very probable. Just to even strengthen your case, I'm not sure, or your audience could check out Jonathan Bernier's Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament, 2022 book that looks at the dating of each book in the New Testament. And like he argues, for instance, that Mark was written in the 40s. And you might say, wow, that's just one scholar. It's wild. Actually, I don't think he's the only one, but it's the most recent scholarship on that. So you'd have to grapple and see where he's wrong. And then, so some of these dates may be quite close as well.
Mm. Yeah, and it feels like an inescapable part. You're always trying to say, what's the plausibility given the worst case scenario? Let's say
Yeah.
Mark is written 70 AD. Is it still a reliable source? And kind of work from those steps backwards. But then if you do get to push it back a couple of decades, man, that lifts the bar of credibility significantly. And I wouldn't say that I'm motivated to have an early dating for the Gospels, but I've just found the earlier arguments far more persuasive. And the standard kind of way that people get there with the Luke Acts volumes, and Acts finishing with Paul under house arrest in Rome, awaiting trial before Caesar, and no end to that story, and no mention of his missionary journeys beyond after escaping arrest, and or his rearrest and his execution under Emperor Nero, or Peter's death, or James being stoned by Ananias the high priest, or all the features that you'd be like really significant guys that would probably make it into a chronicle of the early church, and that it just cuts off unfinished in that way suggests it was written close to the timeline it's describing rather than years later. And so if you have Acts, therefore Luke before, therefore Matthew before, therefore Mark before, it just means you're starting to push back these times in pretty significant ways.
Yep. Yeah, one thing just to add there, yeah, like you said, it's dated worst case scenario, right? Yeah. So in terms of memory, they generally say it's if it happened within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, which is normally put at about 50 years. And so, yeah, there's been studies of particularly from like World War II survivors, and then like, can they remember like what hour it happened, what the weather was like elements of the announcement and stuff like that. And they do cross them against just like your random study groups. Yeah, and they do find that even 50 years later, from people who didn't talk about their memories, they're more probably remembered than not. And then to say, yeah, if people are talking about them more regularly, that would help, which is in the case of the Jesus traditions and gospel stories. So yeah, even as you said, like worst case scenario, there's good reason to think just by normal human memory that these things could have been. It doesn't like guarantee or prove it, but it makes it rational.
And even just like the posture of the disciples to Jesus's teachings. Like if I was a disciple of Alex O'Connor and I'm sitting in the crowd at the Flagrant podcast, like I'm sitting in the gallery and I'm watching them all doing the recordings, and there's cameras everywhere, I can imagine myself with my phone and my notes app open saying, what does teacher Alex say today? Like I am hanging on his every word because I'm waiting to receive from him some new tidbit, some new teaching to what I've heard in the past that I can sit there and record. And so the posture of the disciples as followers of Jesus, following him around, listening to his teaching, they're devoting themselves to their Lord's teaching in a way that the Flagrant team aren't devoting themselves to Alex's teaching as he's sitting there on their couch. They just don't have the same kind of posture towards him with an open expectation to remember his words that's there. And so I just find the more you think about these disanalogies between the scenarios, the more I'm like, no, it's plausible. It's plausible that you could reliably preserve the words of Jesus, particularly when so much of his teaching came in memory aided formats, like these rich parables, or like with the alliteration or parallelism or key standout lines that are very memorable, like the render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God which is God's, or he who is without sin cast the first stone. Very memorable statements of Jesus that are there as well. It certainly seems plausible to me. Anything else you wanted to share with people in terms of how you think memory contributes to thinking about the gospel traditions?
Yeah, well, on that side, I mean, so my work just applies it to Jesus' resurrection. I think that's one of the most interesting ones and apologetically the most crucial. But yeah, one of my supervisors is Robert McIver, and he has the book Memory, Jesus, and Synoptic Gospels. And he applies the same basic, well, he did it, before me, so I'm really building off him. But yeah, to Jesus' aphorisms, like sayings, those short, pithy statements, like you said, render to Caesar, or, things like, you say, who did they? Some say that I am, some say you're the Christ, some say you're Elijah. Who do you say? And he says, yeah, Peter says that. Like that statement would be like a short saying that Christians would likely remember and stuff like that.
Who do you say that I am? Yeah, that's really intriguing, and I just appreciate the kind of framing that you gave at the beginning, where it's keep the main thing the main thing. Is the memory of the apostles reliable when it comes to their testimony on the resurrection of Jesus? If the resurrection is true, Christianity is true, and we may have to quibble over the inspiration and inerrancy of all of the gospels and what we can, really have for certain critically that Jesus said. But in the broad brushstroke, Christianity is true, and that's maybe an important kind of place to anchor. Yeah.
Yep.
Mate, thank you so much for just sharing some of your insights. If people want to pick up Resurrection Remembered, they can do that from Rutledge. They could message you and beg. Is there an audio version of the book? I don't know. Have you done an audio reading of it?
Yeah, I definitely have. I'm not sure.
Man, you should just do that on YouTube. Just you sitting there reading it and being out. Oh, great. You can get a paperback version.
So yeah, it's cheaper.
So people can check that out, particularly how it relates to 1 Corinthians 15. You've been really helpful as I've thought through that chapter, particularly on like the spiritual body, the resurrection body, the sort of soulish body versus the spiritual body, the psyche versus the pneumatikos. And it's just really helpful thinking about what does it mean that Jesus is risen and our resurrection bodies in light of his. Some cool stuff to think about. So thank you for that in the past. And if people want to check out the work that you do, they can check out Why Christianity on YouTube as well. You've got some videos that are around there, which are worth watching too.
Well, just.
Yeah. Any final parting words maybe for people who are considering Christianity, but either have doubts or a degree of skepticism or not sure yet if Jesus is worth believing?
Yeah, it's probably a lot I could say there, but yeah, the reason I'm doing this because it interests me. So I grew up as a pastor's son, but didn't have many Christian friends, and they were nice friends. But at school, we learn different things, like whether it's evolution or why do you bother spending your Sundays at church? Yeah, and so I had questions, and it was apologetics to help me understand my own faith, and it's also been able to help me dialogue with others. And so I've found the more you're strength and encourage in the reasons for Christ, the more it even just emboldens you and gives you confidence. Yeah, and you're not sort of worried that, oh no, someone's going to ask something that I won't know. I found the more you look into it, there's lots of questions, not all of them that I have answers to, but there are some good, deep, rich answers that are in Christ. And so encourage people to keep looking into it and see a life with Christ is full of meaning, and it promises, hope not for this life, but beyond. So yeah, it has eternal implications, and it's worth looking into.
So good. Nate, thanks so much for coming and just sharing your insights with us. If people that have watched through, just want to say a big hello to Braxton Hunter, a mutual friend of the two of ours from over in the USA. He said, hey, I met David on my first trip to Australia, and I met Dan on my second trip. Small worldview world. Hilarious. Well, Braxton, we love you over here. It's amazing you visited Australia twice and didn't get eaten by any of our native wildlife. You're a lucky man to escape twice. A third time, it will not happen again. But hopefully we can catch up in the US sometime soon. Thanks for sharing that comment. Mate, if people want to check out your book, I'll put all those links down below. As we shared, as a bit of a summary of some of the content we've done today, there's this video on the channel down there as well. Check that out, and it goes through these sort of 5 factors that help relate to why the apostles could preserve Jesus's words. Hopefully that'll be useful to you. If you have any other questions, go and check out the litany of content on the channel, hundreds of videos helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And over at our website, questioningchristianity.com, if you love what we do and want to help us reach more people, you can go over there and find out how to give to support this crowdfunded ministry. Please just do all the YouTubey things, like, subscribe, and share with anyone you think this will help. People have been wrestling with that question ever since they saw Alex on Flagrant, and I'm sure that will help get the word out too. Well, until you see us in the next video, truth invites questioning. Peace.